proposition, we're very proud to propose this motion. This House believes that Western nations should make aid conditional on advances in gay rights. Before I go on with my substantive material, I'd like to go on defining some terms. So what we would say as this House is all Western nations, right? That Western nations that have extensive rights, democratic freedom, and that implements advanced equality. And we would say what we mean by aid is any form of assistance that is a one-sided deal. We would not say trade or anything like that. And we would target the countries that extremely oppress the gays, making LGBT illegal, making polarized view about those people, and execute them. For example, Uganda. And we would say that it would have significant advances, like making them illegal, making them legal, like making this gay rights legal, and making the society set. So then we should provide aid if they have this significant advances. And we would say that if these countries make these advances and then change back to their own own views, then we would implement aid restriction on those countries. And we say what we would say as gays is all LGBT people. Okay, so we're going to be showing you our burden to show you guys is one, how it's principally wrong to oppress the LGBT people. Second, how practically this can be changed. This view can be changed. So what we're going to be talking about on side proposition today. First, I'm going to be talking about how this is justified. Second, I'm going to be talking about the efficacy. And third, my partner Luciano will be talking about why aids are counterintuitive. Okay, first, so let's talk about this justification point. So we have 3 subpoints for this. 1, Western views. Second, global views. And third, views in these countries. Okay, so let's talk about the Western views here. So Western nations should do things like aid and movement that align with their views, right? And it's hypocritical if they don't. And my partner would explain directly about the practical harms. Okay, so all Western nations have accepted gays within their society, right? Which means that passing this resolution is very hypocritical for them. Okay, so B, let's talk about the global views. Okay, so the general view of the world is that it's unfair for being discriminated against for being an LGBT person. Why? Because it's natural to be gay, and 1 out of 10 people are naturally LGBT, and it's not a choice. They can't control this, and it's something they're born with, right? And it's wrong for being penalized for what they're born with. And it's also people's sexual preference is incredibly important into their central identity. Because love is their strongest emotion, right? And if we tell them that their sexual preference is unacceptable, their identity will be crushed. And we think that's principally wrong. So it's an international accepted principle that people should be discriminated against. And it's also in the Charter of UN, Human Rights and Freedom, and it states that people have the right to their own sexual orientation. No, thank you. And there's actually tons of precedent for international community taking action against discriminating countries, right? For example, Bahrain, who didn't bring women athletes, he was disallowed in the Olympics until they brought them, right? Those countries, right? And for example, South Africa, no thank you. They didn't allow them in Rugby World Cup and FIFA because they had sanctions placed because of their apartheid government. No thank you. Okay, so C, let's look at the view in that nation, so our third subpoint. Okay, so why do people in that nation don't have the freedom of religion by discriminating the gays? So in these religions, it's stated that marriage should be between men and women. A, it doesn't suggest that you should discriminate against gays or being gay is a sin. It doesn't actually state that. And B, in these religions, they said to treat your neighbors as you would yourself. And then, and be kind to everyone and not to kill another man. And C, even if these religions said it's a duty to persecute these gays, then we think it's not in the freedom to religion to impose their views on other people. And the freedom to religion is allowed to the point that it's infringed upon the rights of the other people, right? Okay, So the LGBT have the freedom to also believe in whatever the religion they want to. And if their religion said, okay, LGBT, if their religion said it's okay to be an LGBT, then it's their choice to be an actual gay or whatever. And often, we're looking at the dictatorship, right? When it's one person that believes in that right, and the majority doesn't agree. Like in these developing nations and like stuff like that, like they often have dictatorships that like one dictatorship believes in like LGBT is a sin, but like the rest of them doesn't really like think so. And before I go on, yes, don't you?
But in that case, if there is a dictatorship, is it right that the people have to suffer and not get aid for something that the government thinks?
Well, that's why we should implement this law, so then the dictatorship, like, they care about the aids that they're being given, so if they change their view, they can get the aids, so we think that, like, we should change that policy. Okay, second, let's talk about our second point, which is efficacy. Okay, so I have a few sub-points for this. A, how countries are reliant on aid. B, I'm going to talk about how this ignites gay movement in countries. And C, I'm going to be talking about the Western states. Okay, let's talk about how countries are reliant on aid. Okay, so we're generally talking about the states that doesn't necessarily have this democratic infrastructure. And this is because if they had it, then they would have the constitution, more democratic accountability, and they would have accountability to the people, to minorities, and like this is empirically true that the majority of countries that oppress the gays and LGBT are developing countries. For example, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, or Uganda, and so on. And also, the aid is generally given to the developing countries. Okay, so this means that they're often the receivers of a lot of aid, and they have built their economic system and viability around this aid. So all of a sudden, the aid stops, they have huge loss in viability, and they suffer, and we think that the people who oppress the gays will take the priority of the money because it preserves them. And oppressing gays is not even comparable to the harm for them. And it's not like they're able to survive them from oppressing the LGBT people. Okay, B, how it ignites gay movement in countries. So in these countries, there are often majority who oppress the minority who are gay. The minority often feels isolated, alone, and if they think that the movements won't work. So then if all Western liberal democracy go out there and say, we have your back, we think it encourages gays to be more open and have in their say. And C, Western states. In the West, the government has done what they can do, right? And some people still don't like the gays. So when Western states take a stand for the gay and say it's unacceptable to discriminate, then this will have to discriminate. We think it powers the LGBT people, but also makes those people feel less right about these discriminating gays. So because of all those reasons I've stated so far, on that proposition, we're very proud to propose this motion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Heidi, for that speech. We now call upon Heidi for Opposition 1.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will prove to you that making aid conditional on advances on gay rights in developing countries is both ineffective and illegitimate in both short-term and long-term. And as a first speaker, I'm going to prove that through 2 points. I'm going to prove why basic living conditions should be focused more on in these developing countries, even if there is a violation of gays, and I'm going to prove that more. And I'm going to also discuss the short-run consequences, in both scenarios, if the government does accept to have non-violation of gays, and if the government does not accept. So before I go to that, I have 4 points of rebuttal that that the proposition team has brought up. First of all, they were talking like for 4 minutes how bad to violate gay rights. We do not say that it is good. we agree with you. And since we want gay rights to be improved properly, we do not want this to happen. And we're going to prove that through my arguments. Secondly, they're talking how love is really important, how people have their sexual identity is really important to them. We believe that this is true, but people in a country where they do not have water, they do not have sanitation, they do not have healthcare, they do not have the basics for survival, they think about that first. I mean, what if you're gay and you don't have food? You're gonna die. You know, you think about the survival first. You think about the food, the aid of food, and the aid of water, the aid of healthcare, the aid of education. So now, what if the government, as you describe this government, are fixed-minded? I mean, they execute gays. So what if they do not accept to not violate gays? Then the whole majority of the population will not have any other aid for Western countries. And that leads me to my second point, which you talked about. You said how economic aid from Western countries is so good. We believe that if the government do not accept to not violate gays' rights, they're not going to have any Western companies there. And in developing countries, the most economic survival they have is from Western countries that come and invest there. Now, if the government does not accept to not violate gay rights, now that's just rebuttal. If the government does not accept to not violate gay rights, the people are not going to have food help, they're not going to have water help, they're not going to have the survival needs from Western countries that they really need to survive, and they're not going to have economic refreshment or economic survival. So now on to my points. I'm going to prove to you how the people are going to be harmed by this, by putting this condition in these countries. Even the gays are going to be harmed, and how the country is going to be harmed. So first of all, we all know and see in news how annually people die from diseases in developing countries, from diseases of water, or from the lack of water, from not having water, from sanitation, bad sanitation, from not having food to survive, from not having healthcare, from not having education. We believe that all these factors that I talked about must come first, because survival comes first than gay rights. Because as I told you before, if a gay do not have survival and have their gay rights, yes, of course they can love and everything, but how can they survive? How can they be alive with only love? I mean, love is not going to feed them, right? So they should think about that. Now, even by implementing this, if the government in both scenarios accepts that these gays should not be violated, or not accept that these gays should not be violated, this will happen anyways. People are going to be harmed, including gays. People are not going to be able to survive in these developing countries. So first of all, we believe that these basic necessities are not going to be given in both cases. So let's discuss when the government does not accept. I mean, you've talked how the government excludes gays, right? So the government is totally fixed-minded. The government has a lot of religion. So they're mostly against the gay rights. So now if let's say they're gonna accept in one case, you know, just because they're forced, just that people are dying and everything, so they do not accept properly. They do not believe that the gays are not gonna be violated. So the gays are gonna be undermined in this country. They're not going to be given proper rights of gays. They're going to always be looking down. And my second speaker will go into that more, and how our system, where aid of food, water, and all these necessities is going to give gay rights more, and is going to give proper gay rights than the system they are imposing. Now let's discuss when the government does not accept to not violate gay rights. So if the government does not accept, okay, so the majority of the people, if the government is corrupt and do not accept to stop violating gay rights, I mean the majority of the people have to pay off this government's mistake. If the government is corrupt and do not want to stop this violation of gay, this is going to cost people's life. People are going to be dying. People already, with Western help of food and sanitation, are already dying. So how do you want to stop all this financial aid, all this food aid, all this survival aid? People are just going to be dying. Yes, they have gay rights, and they can survive with that. Yes.
So you've been spending a lot of time about the necessity of aid. Isn't this exactly why people will come up and say, we want gays to have rights so we can survive?
This is what people will say, and probably people are convinced in these countries that gay rights should not be violated, but the government do not accept. And you just proved that. You said that government exclude gays. I mean, a government who exclude gays for being gay, they're not just going to say, okay, it's fine, we're not going to violate gays anymore. They just, people or governments usually take a lot of time, a lot of years to accept things that are not accepted in their society. It's not just like one day they're going to be like, okay, fine, we're fine with gays. That's not going to happen, and you proved that. So if the government, as I was saying, if the government does not accept that, as I just said, the majority of people are going to be harmed, including gays. Gays are not going to be able to survive. Gays are going to have love, okay, but then, they're going to die. So they're not going to enjoy that love. They're not going to have time to enjoy that love. So secondly, to my second point that you mentioned actually, and I thought it made my work so much easier, the economic aid. As I said, that most of the developing countries have financial and economic survival based on Western countries. Most of the businesses there are Western investments. They're not domestic investments. So by doing that, that means that if the government does not accept stopping violation of gays, the Western world will not give aid, and that's what the motion says. So all the Western countries are not going to be financing there, are not going to be investing there, and thus this will make a lot of problems. First of all, there's no economic survival. These countries are so weak and unstable that they do not have the knowledge to make good investments. They're going to lose a lot of money. Let's say that even these companies do not give a lot of money. I mean, they pay taxes, they give employment. So you're going to take even the people who survive and who have a little bit of food. Then the minority of people, I believe, in most of the developing countries are going to be without jobs, are going to be without economic survival. So please, we want you to prove for us how your system is going to provide survival that is, we believe, more necessary than gay rights. How your system is going to give proper gay rights non-violation. How these people are not just, how the government is not just forced to give these gay rights in order to get aid, which we believe is not going to be as efficient as as our system will give to you in the second speech. Thank you so much.
Okay, we will call upon proposition second speaker, Luciano.
The fatal flaw on side opposition today is that their entire case is based on the claim that people will die because governments will deny gay rights change. And ladies and gentlemen, we think that's a fundamental problem. As long as we prove that's not the case, we think already they conceded so much ground, we think already we take the debate. And we were going to prove to you that that's simply not the case. And I'm going to prove to you even furthermore within my constructive speech that we think aid is actually counterproductive in these case scenarios. But before that, let's get into some quick reconstruction and refutation. First of all, on our side of the house, the first speaker talked about this idea about why we think it's justified to be doing this. They said they agreed on this case, but they said people are going to die, so that's why we don't think it's justified. I'm going to prove to you why we don't think people are actually going to die in the short term. So they agree with our principle that we think we have a moral imperative to help the LGBT community. So at the same time, even though they want to help the LGBT community, they never told us why their side of the house actually helps them. Because their side of the house takes no action to help the LGBT community. They need to explain why we actually help them in the long run on their side of the house. Secondly, on our side of the house, we talked to you about this idea about efficacy. We talked about 3 subpoints. They only really challenged the first one about how governments will change because they need aid. And then I asked the POI about why people will want change. They actually agreed that people will want change. The only part where they disagree with our case is that governments will not want change. I'll explain to you both dictatorships and democracies that they will want change. Let's look at dictatorships. Because dictatorships are in the 21st century based a lot of keeping the people happy economically, right? Because if the people aren't economically happy, we often see that they revolt against the government. The reason why the Arab Spring happened was because the economic growth curve stopped and the people started becoming unhappy with the economic situation, so the revolution happened. We see a lot of governments buying off, the people nowadays. So we think it's actually in the interest of a dictatorship to keep the people economically well, to keep the people economically happy. So we think for them, that's where it works. And if you're looking at a democracy, the people will vote them out, and if it's an incredibly corrupt democracy, then we think obviously action will be taken against them. We think people will end up revolting because they need the actual resources to survive. So we think that falls. So they simply just claim that governments won't accept it. We don't think that's a claim they can just make. So additionally, what we would say is that they also brought up this argument on their first speech, basically just about this idea about basic living conditions. First of all, we showed you that there would be change, so these problems wouldn't even happen in the first place. But additionally, they said the governments are totally fixed. First of all, this is an assumption. They never told us why governments are totally fixed. Second of all, what we would say is that these governments also are totally fixed on keeping their people surviving, and we think that's the priority for them. We never saw any analysis about why denying gays their rights was the priority for these governments on their side of the house. That was just an assumption. And they said that no matter what, these gays will be always looked down on. First of all, on our side of the house, we actually have improvement. We have legal improvement where these gays are able to, have much more legal, survivability, are actually able to resist this oppression. But additionally, what we would say is that this instigates the kind of change where it changes the mindset within that country. If the government says it's okay, we think that fundamentally enables these people to have much more change, and it also changes the mindset within that country. Sure.
Don't you believe it's development and stability which changes the minds, not just the way the government thinks?
First of all, that's an assumption. That's not necessarily the case. If you develop, we don't think that necessarily means that you're going to be changing in this kind of mindset as well. But secondly, what we would say is I'm going to be talking about why long-term development actually exists on our side of the house, not on your side of the house. So let's get right into it, actually. First of all, this idea, I'm going to be talking about this idea about how aid is counterintuitive. First of all, how it funds repression. So fundamentally, governments need money, right? And they need money to be able to find and oppress the LGBT community. And this is something that is essential for them to actually do these activities. So ladies and gentlemen, what we would say is when we give them this aid, we think we actually give them the tools they need to be able to repress the LGBT community. We think we empower the governments to keep on doing the illegitimate things they're doing, and we think we fundamentally feed them to do these completely wrong things. Ladies and gentlemen, when we gave aid to Uganda, economic aid, what we saw is they actually allocated some of that money to actually create a secret police that would find the LGBT community and even jail them and sometimes execute members of the LGBT community. We think this is fundamentally wrong, where their side of the house empowers these governments to actually do this. We think they actively encourage the problem on their side of the house. But let's look at why development actually goes hand in hand with equality. We think these two things are incredibly important to have. First of all, what we would say is that if the LGBT community is constantly fearing persecution, if they're, all trying to escape the police, if they're in jail, we think that effectively hampers a huge amount of the percent of the population that can actually be able to work, that can actually be able to contribute to economic growth. But additionally, what we would say is that cooperation is one of the most important things within the 21st century economy. If a community cannot cooperate, we don't think they can provide each other with the benefits that are actually necessary to be able to work together. We think the way the 21st century works is we have interdependency, where countries trade with one another, people trade with one another to get the resources they need. We think when we have this fundamental disconnect within the community, you can't have that. You can't have cooperation between these fundamental groups to be able to further the actual development within that country. We think that these secluded communities fundamentally create that problem. We think that's incredibly harmful for these developing nations. But additionally, what we would say is when they try to focus on repressing these actual LGBT communities and not, focus on actually feeding their people, focus on development, when they spend billions of dollars for those purposes, we think that wastes money. They should be allocating on much more better things that can actually help the people. So we think in this way, aid is completely counterintuitive and it actually harms the fundamental development we really need to see. But additionally, what we'd say is that aid is also a lot to help Western governments. We think aid actually does things like it's supposed to also benefit Western nations in relations and stuff like that. But what we would say is that on our side of the house, we actually provided to you benefits about to Western nations because we think that it actually inspires the Western movement even more, and we think that it empowers the people in the West even more as well. So we think that fundamentally on their side of the house, they have completely counterintuitive aid, which we can be allocating to much more efficient usage, and usage where it won't be used to repress people, to usage where we would see actual development. And we think by denying this aid to encourage the gay movement, we have much more long-term development. So what we've essentially seen on this side of the house today is a claim that was based on assumption that was their entire case. We've defeated that for you today. We've brought to you actually why we think we have more growth in that side of the house. And ladies and gentlemen, because their side of the house doesn't improve the lifestyle for the LGBT community, because our side of the house empowers the LGBT community, we are so very proud to propose on side proposition today.
Okay, we now call upon the second opposition speaker.
Okay, so first of all, I'm going to start with some rebuttal. The first one, well, actually, really, it was a question. Wait, maybe I should go into that later. First of all, it was this idea that if we give them money, if we fund them with aid, then they'll use this aid to suppress the LGBT community. However, if we're giving aid to these countries to do this, and they're tricking us, and they're using this money for something else, couldn't that same government trick us and say that they're implying gay rights? So technically, you having that argument isn't really an argument because it explodes in your faces. And also, if we were to implicate aid, we could also add regulations. So if our side was put forth, we could add regulations and they could be made so we make sure that the LGBT community isn't oppressed with the funds that they get. Also, there was this idea that Western nations will support them in other ways, like through investments. So we should have gay rights so that we won't support them through other ways. But what we're discussing here is aid, and I think that's what is most important. Another question that they asked was, the government won't accept the LGBT community, and they asked us to define, I think it was, to show that denying the LGBT rights isn't part of the government. And that's what I'm going to do today, because what we're going to prove to you guys is that making aid conditional is illegitimate and it's ineffective. And it's illegitimate because in the short term it leaves people hungry, and in the short term it's not fair for people to be judged on how the government acts. And what I'm going to be focusing on is how it's ineffective, because the gay rights will not be applied in a way that gives them full force and that gives them full acceptance in the community. What they have to show us is that basic rights, gay rights are more important than basic rights of living conditions, which they've failed to show why those are more important. And they've also got to show how their system is more effective, which they've not even mentioned at all, how implicating their side of the motion, you can mention that later, is more important, how their side of the motion will make gay rights as effective as it can be. But I'm going to show you that now, because I'm going to add another thing to the table. So let's look at these Western ideals that you call them, Western ideals. What do these arise from? Western ideals and ideals of acceptance arise from communities where people are stable, where people don't have to worry about where their next meal are coming from, where people don't have to worry about how they're going to feed their children, where there's stability in a nation. Then ideologies arise. And we can see this in history. We can see that as soon as a country becomes stable, as soon as a country doesn't have to worry about war and conflicts and feeding their children and malnutrition, then they can start focusing on accepting people, whether it be men or women, whether it be black or white, whether it be gay people or straight people. That happens with development. And in our side, we're proposing, not that we will oppress the lesbian gay community, but that we'll be making it more effective in the long term, because we'll be, through this financial aid, we'll be supporting development. Yes?
In America, it took a civil war, it took 100 years for them to change. Are you saying we want that for these countries as well?
I don't see your point, because surely development is what caused all of these ideologies which now exist in the United States. So if we want to implicate these ideologies, surely we want to have more development, and that happens in a nation slowly. So if you're saying that America had flaws, it happened slowly, and implicating them very quickly, which is your solution, wouldn't actually fix the problem, because it's a gradual process. And I'll show you why it's a gradual process. It's a gradual process because if people have to constantly think about where their next meal is coming from, about the instability of their nation, then it's systematically ingrained. And if it's systematically ingrained in the system due to religion and other things to be against gay people, then you can't implicate a quick solution. A quick solution won't work. I'll show you why. Because let's see, what did I have here? Because if you implicate this very quickly, they'll be forced to accept gay rights. They'll be forced to change their way of thinking in a very quick way. A way of thinking that might be for the people might be ingrained within them. They'll be forced to change that very quickly, which means that other emotions about, say they set up an association for gay rights, it means that that gay rights association may have bad connotations, because the people don't actually agree with this, because of the backwardness of their way of thinking about acceptance. No, thank you. Makes them think this way. They will immediately assume that these gay rights associations are a bad thing. They'll have a bad connotation because they're forced, because they're not organic. If you say that the rights that we consider our Western ideals are very important today, you cannot say that they are important today because they have been forced. They're important today because organically we have realized that they're important. And why have we realized they're important? We've realized because we belong to a stable community. We belong to a community where we don't have to worry about where our next meal is coming from. We can worry about what is right and what is wrong, who should be accepted and who should not be accepted, and of course the fact that everybody should be accepted, even if they are gay. And of course, so we've shown that even if the government does accept it, it won't be effective. Because if the government accepts it, they'll still have this ingrained idea, and they'll still, even if there are associations, they'll think of about this in a bad connotation, because the people have this systematic ingrained way of thinking. And you can't change a system very quickly. You can't change a system by making the government say, oh, okay, we want AIDS, we'll change it really quickly. Sure, we'll do that. That's not how gay rights works, and that's actually an insult to gay rights, because it's not something that is quick and trivial like that. It's not economic. It's something that has to do with people, and it has something else has to do with human rights and how people are all equal. No, thank you. And also, if the governments are as corrupt and as horrible as they explained, as in the case their example was Uganda, they gave many other examples, if they don't, the problem with these nations is there is a high chance that they won't accept. And if they don't accept, you go back to our original, no thank you, our original argument that you're denying people the right to food, and you're denying people the right to the development that their country should have, and the right to the development that will eventually lead to accepting people and to gay rights. No thank you. So I'll talk about this again in the idea that their solution is illegitimate, because people should be given these basic living conditions, because these basic living conditions are vital, because people are dying. And if people are dying, this is an immediate problem. People are dying all the time. We don't want people to die from malnutrition, from all the issues that developing countries face. And also because if people are dying, they won't have the time to change their ingrained way of thinking, which is most important. If you want something like gay rights to be valid, to be applicable, to be useful, you have to change the way people are thinking. And the way people are thinking doesn't just work if the government says, now we want you to think. It doesn't just work, now we want you to think differently. It doesn't just change if Western nations say, now we want you to change differently, think differently. It has to happen in the thinking, and the thinking happens when people are stable and when people have the room to think and the room to change how they feel. So other ideas that people should starve just because the way the government feels. And we showed you that, that our system is both legitimate and it's effective, and they failed to show both of these things. Thank you.
Liberty, equality, prosperity. It's on those fundamental principles that we've been so proud to propose. And what has side opposition stood for in this debate? They've had a hung case that's based off of this idea of survival. They've had a hung case that's based upon a burden they didn't actually prove, and they just asserted to us throughout this debate, ladies and gentlemen. And they've had a hung case that's so bad that even in their best case scenario, they don't actually effectively produce change, ladies and gentlemen. They agreed with our justification, but then just said, well, we're gonna hang our saying it's unjustified on our practical, which we haven't actually proved. We want to challenge them to prove to us why governments won't change, and we've given them a lot of analysis which they haven't responded to. And we have to challenge them to prove to us how on their side of the house they actually do achieve change for these LGBT people, and how we actually slow down change, because they just said it happens organically, and I'm going to rebut that completely within my case. So I'm going to look at this debate through two main lenses, two main themes. First of all, justification. Second of all, efficacy. Now most of the rebuttal is on efficacy, so I'm just going to shortly brief you on justification. So what did we tell you, ladies and gentlemen? We told you it's hypocritical for Western nations principally to give aid to these nations, since it doesn't align with their views, since Western nations are pro-equality, anti-discrimination. We told you the global views our anti-discrimination. Globally, people think it's okay to be gay. They think it's natural to be gay. We pointed out to you that sexual preference is part of someone's identity, and we gave you examples of how it's within the UN Charter. We told you the targeted nations, and we pre-rebutted this notion, which they didn't even end up resorting to, in this idea of freedom of religion. And they essentially just had a weak rebuttal. They just said, oh, yeah, we agree with you, but we think basic living conditions are more important. Once again, that's a hung case. That's contingent upon an idea they haven't proved, and that basic living conditions will be harmed on our side of the house. We don't think they will. And yeah, and then we told you, because we told you this will not affect survival since change will happen. Their case is fundamentally hung. It's hung upon the second theme today of efficacy. So efficacy, ladies and gentlemen. We told you countries are dependent upon aid. This is the key analysis here. They're dependent. Even when they're non-democratic and developing, and they're very dependent upon this aid which we give them. They didn't engage with us on that. We told you the harm to the loss of money is way higher comparative to their fixed ideas and their religion, which they tried to talk about, and they haven't engaged with us on that. We told you it even empowers LGBT in Western nations, and it empowers the LGBT within these nations, so they're going to go themselves and advocate for their own rights and have this will be a catalyst for change, ladies and gentlemen. We told you it's counterintuitive for us to be giving money to oppression. We told you also it aids in development because equality is about cooperation. Cooperation aids in development. It aids in cohesion within society. Now, what did they say? Well, they came here with this idea of survival. They said, well, the government won't accept, and then all the people won't have food, all the people won't have basic necessities. This is an assertion, ladies and gentlemen. Why won't they accept? We think they fundamentally will. We gave you this analysis on dependence, which they even conceded to. And they said, well, okay, maybe the governments will accept, but the governments are then corrupt, and we also gave you this analysis on why if the people are dying, as they say, then the people will push for it, and even if the people don't care, even if the people don't support gays, they're going to care more about survival. Like they said, survival is an important thing, and it's going to lead to these people pushing their leaders for change. They said, well, governments are corrupt, they're dictatorships. We gave you effective analysis. My speaker told you that even in these corrupt governments, even in these dictatorships, first of all, the corrupt governments and dictatorships need money too. They need the money to, fund their military so they can keep their power. And also, if people are dying, these governments are still accountable to those people. What happens if the people are dying, if they're bad economic conditions? They're going to protest. We gave you examples in the Arab Spring when the people were able to overthrow their leaders because economic conditions were not good. We gave you another more recent example in Ukraine where a corrupt government had bad economic conditions. The people protested, they overthrew him. Even these corrupt governments, even these democratic leaders do have to care for the economic conditions of their people. And then the second speaker kind of came up and she gave you this new idea. She said, if we're giving aid and we're telling them that we're giving them aid and then they're not using it for the right things, and they say, well, if we're giving aid and they're tricking us, then they could just trick us with and say they're helping the gays, but they won't. Now, what we say to you, ladies and gentlemen, is it's much comparatively harder for these governments to trick us on whether or not they're accepting the gays, because you can actually see discrimination. You can see if they're going and executing gays. It's much harder for them to actually trick us. Whereas if how they're allocating their money and how they're spending their money is something secret, so it's much easier, it's much harder for them to trick us on their side of the house. We don't think they can just go and say, oh, they'll trick us with this too. That's a weak rebuttal. Then they said, they said development, we should have this idea of development, then equality. No, ladies and gentlemen, we don't think that just because you develop, that means you're going to get equality automatically. We look at examples of China. China is economically developed. They're one of the richest nations in the world. They don't have strong equality. My partner asked a POI about America. He told you it took hundreds of years, even when America was one of the most prosperous nations in the world, economically developed, and running high on an agriculture-based economy, and they had to fight, have civil wars for equality. It doesn't just come naturally as they say. And we think this is also contingent upon rebutting our claims that this doesn't hurt development and actually aids development. I'll take you through a while.
China is not considered a developed country.
China is not considered a developed country. It's China. I'm telling you, China is developed equality. What you're saying is once these countries develop economically, they're going to automatically have, equality. I'm telling you, China is developed economically. It's one of the richest nations in the world, but it doesn't have equality. That's my claim. And then they also, really asserted this idea of, first of all, in the second speaker's speech, they said it's illegitimate. That's an assertion. We think we gave you examples of how we make aid conditional. For example, with North Korea, we made aid conditional. We gave them aid and food, conditionable upon the fact that they stopped their nuclear technology and stopped developing their nuclear technology. It's an assertion. They haven't proved it's illegitimate. Then they came to you with this idea of organic and natural acceptance, how we don't need to do this. Ladies and gentlemen, we tell you organic or natural acceptance is much easier on our side of the house. It's much easier for this acceptance of these people to happen when they're not being executed, when they're not ostracized to society. We tell you our resolution is going to be a catalyst for this organic, natural acceptance, because LGBT people will actually be able to come out. They'll actually be able to be accepted within society. People, talk with them on the streets and begin to accept them. We tell you it's fundamentally a good thing because we speed up this. We give a catalyst for this change, or catalyst for this organic acceptance. Ladies and gentlemen, we think they have a hung case. We think they've made a lot of assertions, and that's why we're so proud to propose.
Okay, opposition third, Joel.
The proposition side has claimed that we have made a lot of assertions that we have not proven. And one of these assertions that they claim we have made is that the government will not accept on these terms. And we never said that. What we have said is that there is absolutely no guarantee whatsoever that the government will accept. They claim that because of the fact that they're in a developing country, because of the fact that they have such very fixed views, both in the government as well as in the people, structurally, there is no guarantee that the government will accept. And there's also what we said when we talked about if the government did accept is that we said that the harms are still bad because of the fact that even if the government were to accept, it doesn't mean that structurally all these people will suddenly accept LGBT people. LGBT violence will still occur. Just because of the fact that the government accepts this thing doesn't mean that structurally everything will change. And so what we proved is that in the long run, it's much more effective to go with our proposal, and that is to not accept their proposal, rather, of trying to force this thing upon the government and force this thing upon the people that that is so structurally ingrained in them that they will not do it. And so because of this this forced activism or these forced ideals onto them will not have any effect, will not have the desired effect of decreasing LGBT violence or anything like that, which they claim to care so much for these lives of the people. And so we have proved to you in this debate exactly why their proposal is ineffective, and we have proved to it, although they've claimed that we've only asserted it, which is completely incorrect, that it is also illegitimate. So because they claim that that the illegitimacy was only an assertion, I'll prove to you exactly how we proved it. And so we proved it by saying that, you know, and I've already proved that there's no guarantee of governments accepting anything, and so we proved that it's illegitimate because if in the case that the government does in fact not accept it, this means that, you know, far more deaths.
Sir?
No, thank you. Far more deaths will occur because of this lack of sanitation, water, which are also basic human rights, just as gay rights, and so. We've proven that it's
Sir.
no, thank you. We've proven that it's very illegitimate to make this aid conditional because of the fact that you're leaving it up to a chance of whether or not the government will accept, and if they don't, the consequences are absolutely disastrous for the local population who have no say in this. And so. So that, no, thank you very much. So that's exactly why we have proved it's illegitimate. And so the argument that they made of why this is legitimate, why this is justifiable, is that we have to protect the gays. It's okay to be gay. Western ideals say that LGBT is good, and it would be hypocritical not to enforce these ideals onto other countries as well. And so let's go over this claim that the Western world unanimously agrees that the LGBT rights are important. If we look at
Sir.
No, thank you. If we look at Western countries right now, if you look at the USA, they have a lot of states that absolutely don't accept Western rights. So if we're going to be talking about hypocrisy, maybe, you know, the important thing is to focus on these USA rights. So hypocrisy is absolutely not an argument that we will accept in this debate. And so they talked about why it's the legitimacy, or the justification of, no thank you, of not giving aid, because aid can fuel repression. And while perhaps aid can fuel repression, but we can regulate this aid that we're giving them. We can regulate this. Governments don't just give money to people and hope they do the right things with them. Governments regulate this aid. And so, and you know, in addition to this, it's not only the government that are oppressing these people. I mean, a large amount of LGBT oppression is done by the civilian people. You know, people hate crimes and
Sir.
and LGBT violence. Yes.
But isn't it still a huge benefit if the government does not persecute these gays? You haven't shown us why that isn't something that exists on our side of the house.
Well, because of the fact that you're risking it on the fact that the government will go after this you know, will accept your proposal, and you're risking it too hard that you know, all these bad things will not occur. And so if we then go over to why exactly we won the clash of whether it's effective or not, I'll go back to this because you don't seem to understand it, and that is that that is that if they're saying that if you know, not getting aid is an incentive to accept it, but it's not it's not a very strong incentive, as we said, because of the fact that that it's so structurally ingrained into the system of hating, of you know, being against the LGBT community. And so let's say the government agrees that this doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to, you know, they may change their policies, but there's no guarantee that they're going to that they're not going to be corrupt and, you know, only say that they're changing policies,
Sir.
however not enforcing them. No, thank you. And so, and also, let's say the government does enforce it, which obviously it won't. The people are not going to suddenly, you know, a large mass of people, an entire
Sir.
country, no thank you, are not going to magically change their minds at the flip of a coin, at the, all of a sudden, just because of the fact that that the government says gives rights to the LGBT people. Thank you. And so, like I've said, LGBT violence will still be okay. And you brought up this interesting argument about the Arab Springs and how you know, the government, like let's say the people really like, you know, gay people, and the government has to absolutely, you know, please these people so that uprisings won't occur. I've just told you that you know, the people in these countries, they also hate gays, and so it's not a question.
But sir,
no, thank you. It's not a question about whether or not. It's not a question about whether or not, you know, keeping people happy will it is something that the government.
Sir?
No, thank you. It's something that the government needs to focus on. It's the fact is that it's a question of whether or not the people actually want to support LGBT rights, which in developing countries, because of, no, thank you, because of the fact that they are so. They're so, let's say, backwards, according to these Western ideals that you say we all have. They are so backwards that they have no, there's no way that such a large mass of people are going to change their mind. And so let's look at what I've said. We've proved why exactly it's absolutely illegitimate to be doing what they're doing, because there's no guarantee that the government will accept it, and we've proven why it's ineffective to do so. Also, because in the long term, it's much better to develop the society first, so that activism and gay rights can come organically, instead of forcing them onto a bunch of people that will not that will not necessarily change their mind, and this will not prevent LGBT violence. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we have won the debate today. Thank you very much.
Okay, we now call upon the reply speaker for opposition.
Alright, so to conclude this debate, I'm going to give you guys some insight into the two different things that we've proposed, and I'll show you by their perspective, and then I'll show you by showing what our perspective is, and the two different worlds that our sides of the motion would create. So their perspective is that developing nations with economic and social issues are denied the right to develop if they are an anti-gay nation. And their growth should be stunted if they are an anti-gay nation that refuses to accept. Ignoring the fact that it is this aid that in itself might effectively eradicate these anti-gay ideals, which we have showed, which I will go into. So by not giving economic and social support to the anti-gay communities, you actually thus stunting the development of both, well, their development economically, but also how they will respond to the lesbian gay community, and how they will accept people of all types of people. Their world is a world where systematically ingrained ideals of non-tolerance will never be changed, because acceptance comes with stability. Why does acceptance come with stability? Acceptance comes with stability because when people are able to be granted education, when people are able to be granted the right to have as much food as they want, then they are able to start questioning these ideals of how we are as human beings, instead of just survival instincts. So they'll be able to question, how should we interact as human beings, not how should I get food on my table. So their system is a system where they really underestimate how quickly a question like lesbian gay rights can be applied into a nation, and they really underestimate how this can be done. I'll show you what our perspective is. Our perspective is a perspective where there is a fundamental difference between the economic growth of a country and the change of ideology. And they asked us, how do we know that these people have this ideology? It's an anti-gay nation. That's part of the definition. They will have this ideology. So how do we change this ideology? How do we change this ideology, since it's different than economic development? Well, we say that it's not a question of changing one and changing the other. It's a question of changing one, which then leads to the other. One comes after the other. You need economic development, you need stability and security in a nation, and then you can implicate these ideologies. Our system is a system where people of anti-gay nations are still giving food, which means that they can develop more, and they can develop more, and they can eventually implicate more accepting ideologies with their people. And our perspective is a perspective where we acknowledge the fact that gay rights is not something that can just happen tomorrow, which is what they are proposing. We're proposing that it's something which is gradual and long-term, which they've actually inadvertently shown through their America example. It's something that can't happen quick. It's something that has to happen slowly. We've shown that our system is a system that's more organic. It's a system that will be more effective. And why is it important that it's effective? It's important that it's effective because then there will be better quality of gay rights. And that's what we want, isn't it? We want gay rights where the equality is what matters. That's why our perspective is better, because the gay rights that we will be implicating are gay rights where it will be more useful, where people will be even more accepted, instead of gay rights where it's been forced and there is probably a lot of discussion and where people can't come to one actual decision. Ours is better quality for people because we accept that people should be given this right. Thank you.
From the very get-go, they conceded that we have a moral imperative to help the LGBT community and that discrimination against them is bad. So they made my job really easy to deal with what side actually benefits practical change. So I'm going to define this into two questions. Which side fosters change and which side helps people survive? So let's get into this idea about fosters change. So first of all, they had this idea about organic change. First of all, what we would say on our side of the house is that this organic change is incredibly inefficient. We brought forth to you examples of America, where it took so very long to have organic change, and it took a civil war to get to that organic change. We told you that it results in lots of suffering during that period, and also we told you that it's not necessarily the case where you can just assume that economic success and viability means that people will try to actually change. But if that were the case, we proved to you that we speed up development on our side of the house because development and equality go hand in hand. They never refuted that case scenario. But additionally, what we would say is that legal change is legal change. If the government stops persecuting the LGBT community, that can happen instantly, right? It's a decision between persecuting them or not persecuting them, right? Changing the law from making it illegal to be part of the LGBT community to making it legal to be an LGBT community is something that can be changed like that. It's not necessarily the case where it has to be organic change for that legal change. Additionally, they said that, we talked about, governments will change. And we gave you 3 points of analysis. A, they need aid. B, this empowers the people within those nations. And C, this encourages Western change as well. They never refuted the other 2 ones, and so I'm only going to talk about the reconstruction of why we need aid. So they said, they're based on the aid, and they're based on their views and they won't change. First of all, they said that people will want change. Like when I asked the POI to their second speaker, they said, oh, sure. And when we brought forth to you an analysis on why governments will change according to people, they never actually refuted that specific analysis. We think that still stands. And they never actually told us why governments will necessarily change. They just kept on saying that. Also, they said that LGBT violence will still happen. Even if it did happen, we think it would happen in a very smaller scale because now it's illegal to do so. So we think there are still huge benefits. They never showed to us why their side of the house actually fosters change. So let's go into this idea about why people survive, which pretty much their entire case was hung on because this was the only harm they actually talked about, that people will die. So first of all, we think this was incredibly hung. We refuted told you why governments will actually change. They never refuted that analysis. But additionally, what we would say is that this would happen in a very short-term scale. Whereas in the long term, we would see huge improvements of LGBT rights. We would see huge change. We would see huge fostering of development. They also said, what if they just, trick us? First of all, if they were so efficient at tricking us in the first place, how would we know that these gay rights were really bad in those countries in the first place? But additionally, what we would say is that if we do find out that they're doing these kinds of things, we'll just resume these, kind of cutting of aid, as my first speaker already said in her model. And additionally, on our side of the house, we told you this. We said that, development is something that's really important. We agree with that, and we think that works with equality. They never refuted that basis. Additionally, we said that, aid will be given badly. They said, you can just regulate it. First of all, there's very often times where you can't actually regulate it because there's very little accountability measures to these countries. We saw in North Korea when we actually gave them aid in return for something, they didn't actually fulfill the criteria. We saw in Uganda where they actually utilized it to actually repress the gays even more. They never actually refuted that basis. So in the world of side opposition, as they said, we actually only see one harm, and that one harm was that people will die. We refuted that. We see on our side of the house, we see legal improvement. We see acceptance improvement. We see the reducing of bigotry because people are able to live that are LGBT people. And ladies and gentlemen, because we want to stop persecution, ladies and gentlemen, because we want to move away from olden times where we saw discrimination, we are so very proud to propose on side proposition.